Tonight on the CBS Late Movie, chilling suspense as apes reveal the truth about the fate of mankind.
お聞きいかがですか？渡辺ダンです。On today's episode of Hollywood Rants, we're going to take a look back at some of Hollywood's past. And one of the things we're going to look at is that the New Republic last week republished a story from 1995 that was discussing the state of the entertainment industry. And we're going to go over that article and talk about some of the things it mentions, some of the things that happened to the people who are mentioned in it, and discuss why this article is relevant to what is happening in Hollywood today. But first, I have to do a retraction. In my previous video, I talked a lot about how MGM just was bought out by Apple. And of course, I was wrong about that. It was Amazon. But blame me for the fact that I was conflating a rumor from a couple of years ago with the fact of what happened. So I will be very careful to not just assume that because it's an A that it's the same thing. Anyway, let's take a look at the article and see what it says. And I will go through it as we go along. So this is the article. It says, the National Review Film Classics, The Case Against Hollywood from April 10th, 1995. I'm going to say that a lot of the things it points out in this article are still indeed relevant for today. For example, it talks about how so much of Hollywood spends its time surrounding itself with the bling of the industry, meeting at the same restaurants all the time. And in the process of meeting at the same restaurants all the time, not really paying attention to anything other than the conversations that are going on and what's in it for me. Not necessarily looking to make better content, but instead looking to better one's position. Now, as the article goes on, they talk about some of the things that have been happening in the industry and about how it has been a very, very good year in Hollywood. One of the things that's notably missing from this conversation is the fact that just 2 years before, the financial interest in syndication rules had been allowed to sunset. The financial interest in syndication rules mandated that networks would only be allowed to have 2 showings of every single episode of a series that they were putting up. They would have no ability to profit from the reruns that would come later. Those would be left to the independent producers. Well, Hollywood pretended that that was just too much of a burden for it to tolerate. So they petitioned and they lobbied Congress until Congress allowed that act to expire. And immediately, all of the networks basically said, forget it, unless we get a percentage and a big percentage of the back end, we're not going to even consider putting your show on the air. And this was made worse by the fact that they weren't necessarily willing to step up with more money up front, meaning that the independent producer would be deficiting more than ever. Now, obviously, this was going to shake out over time, but this happened to coincide at the same point with with the 1947 Paramount Decree, which had separated the theaters from the studios. Remember that the theaters own the studios, not the other way around, despite what you see in many film history textbooks. And what that meant was that you couldn't have a vertically integrated company that controlled both the means of production, distribution, and exhibition. And with that not being enforced, although it didn't really go away completely until 2020, you allowed a lot more vertical integration within the industry. The first example of that happening was the Walt Disney Company buying ABC, which had been enjoying a very successful run with series like NYPD Blue and many others. Well, ABC took, with Disney in charge, they wasted no time in basically saying that every single show that we were going to put up on the air from now on would come from Disney. And this had the problem of putting, instead of having a show that was not working only run for 6 episodes and then disappear, Disney would say, no, we have too much of an investment. Let's try it for 9, then 13, then 22. And then now all of a sudden you have an entire season of a show that's not working. And so rather than losing just, let's say, $6 million, because that's about the budget of the shows at that time, maybe a little bit more, now you were losing 22 million, and you multiply that out over numerous shows, and you can see where this was turning into a bad thing. So bad, in fact, that that Disney had to completely retrench, and for a while it looked like ABC itself might be at risk. It took the millionaire in order to turn that around. Now, the article goes over some other things that were happening, such as most of the content at that time was coming across as being way too prepackaged and way too focused on the money that was coming out rather than basic creativity. I'm going to say that when we hear a lot of the titles today, we're going to say, well, those movies tended to be better. Now, admittedly, one of the movies that they did not like was Forrest Gump. I don't like Forrest Gump either. I don't think it's passed the test of time at all. And they were comparing those to classics like Grapes of Wrath, which I don't like either, and On the Waterfront, which I do like, to the dribble that was being produced that was very meretricious, such as When a Man Loves a Woman. Which, as you remember, was an Andy Garcia movie about the problems of alcoholism. And there were other films that were coming out, such as Pulp Fiction, which were still trying to make the difference. But the article slams pictures such as True Lies, The Addams Family, and Patriot Games, and Wayne's World. I'm going to say that for many moviegoers today, True Lies looks like an absolute classic, and so does Patriot Games. Although I'll be honest that perhaps Addams Family doesn't look all that good. The article, as was true anytime when you're looking at the present, you're going to look through a rose-colored glass at the past. And in this case, they were looking at the rose-colored glass of the 80s, when you had movies such as Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Reversal of Fortune, Blue Velvet, Dead Ringers, Edward Scissorhands, Goodfellas, T2, Die Hard, admittedly all very good movies. But whenever you look through a romantic lens at the past, you are eliminating the POS pieces of garbage that were around at the same time. And certainly when we look back at the 90s now, the 90s does look indeed pretty good because we've forgotten all of those awful movies that never really went beyond the very, very basics. The article then talks a little bit about Ricardo Mestres, who had been put in charge of Hollywood Pictures. Now, it doesn't really go into Ricardo Mestres's past very much, other than the fact, of course, he's Harvard educated and very much a product of that type of upbringing. What's interesting about Mestres is that he was, in fact, one of the last major executives on any of the studios or on the networks or anywhere else who was not white. He was Hispanic, and he was running a very substantial part of the Walt Disney empire. Now, I'm going to share the screen again, and we're going to go through some of the things that they say was definitely problematic in Hollywood of that era. And what that was that you had things such as the deal is more important than the movie. Well, we know that this is even more true today than it was at that time. In fact, at that time, yes, the deal was very important in terms of getting the movie made, but there was still attention paid to the script and how it would play out with audiences. Whereas today, a lot of the big deals that I'm seeing happening at Netflix and at Apple TV and even to some degree at Amazon, they seem to be things that were greenlit without anybody even bothering to read the script. So the deal happens, and It's almost as if because the deal is so ingenious, you're not even bothering to care about the content at all. Might as well film the deal, right? And then the next thing was the rise of the executive, that rather than the creatives, such as the writer or the director or the producer being at the top, it's now the studio executives. And me as a development exec, I'm like, yeah, I understand this. I understand that there were a lot of studio execs, even in my day, who weren't really worth the salaries they had. But one of the things that a studio executive brings to the production process is they make sure that every single movie that is being done fits more or less within the corporate structure, so that your company is making movies of a certain type. And that way the audience knows what they're getting when they watch a movie from your company. Now, you might say, well, the audience doesn't know and doesn't care. They don't know directly, they know indirectly. They know that for a while, hey, going back to Ricardo Mestres, if you saw the Hollywood Pictures logo, which was of a Sphinx, you'd say, what's this? If it's a Sphinx, it stinks. And you would have, if it's Orion, you knew it was going to be fairly low budget and was going to have an artistic edge to it. Well, by this time, I think Orion was already pretty much gone. The rise of everybody except for writers and directors. This was very true. And it was indeed problematic. And you did have directors like Tim Hunter who would do something as transgressive as River's Edge, about a bunch of alienated teenagers discovering a body on the side of a river and absolutely not having any moral reaction to it. Similar to the movie Kids by Kenneth Park, which came out around the same time. Now, Tim Hunter would go on to direct the pilot for Beverly Hills 90210. So you can see that he followed the money train rather than the artistic train. The rise of screenwriting programs. And yes, this was the era when Final Draft and a lot of the other software was there, but it was also a time when you started having Sid Field, who wrote the screenplay, and Robert McKee, and all of these other quote unquote script gurus doing workshops that executives attended. Now, I was forced to attend one with Robert McKee, who had been one of my teachers at USC, and I had not thought much of him. And so when I had to attend one of his seminars, knowing that as a development exec, I was going to be expected to put every single script and project that came through Robert McKee's method, I felt very, very dim about that, because quite frankly, to me, Robert McKee, like Sid Field, was very doctrinaire, and art is not doctrinaire. You have to look at a piece of work for what it is, not because it fits perfectly within some paradigm that was created after the fact. Certainly, when some of the great masterpieces of Hollywood's past were made, they weren't made with this kind of built-in inciting incident and rising action and character change and on all these other things. And it certainly doesn't work for overseas movies. So it really kind of turned a lot of American cinema, theatrical, into almost like a TV movie, where because you have ads coming every 20 minutes or so, you have to structure around those ad breaks. Nothing wrong with that, but that is a different creative process than writing something that is going to appeal more emotionally, the way that a feature film is supposed to, compared to a TV movie. And then it talks about Jeffrey Abrams, familiar last name. The hit-driven film economy was next. And the hit-driven film economy has really always been with us. So obviously this writer wasn't aware that even in the 1920s and 30s, you were primarily there in any kind of an executive capacity to come up with something that would make money and would be a hit. But they do have a point in that in the 90s, because of the Wall Streetization, you had the beginning of PowerPoint culture, where instead of looking at a piece of work and saying, here's who the audience for this is, here's how this can be broken out, here's how it can win certain awards, and through that, make all sorts of money. Instead of that, you were looking at things that became easier to sell. So you were looking at it from that PowerPoint presentation aspect, where as long as you checked the right boxes, you felt that you were guaranteed a hit. And that wasn't necessarily the case. The movie that they mention in here is, of course, Waterworld, and then The Postman, two Kevin Costner big budget movies that basically deep sixed his career. And then it says everybody knows that nobody knows everything. This is true, and it also is in direct contrast to what had become industry lore, and that was that William Goldman wrote a book, one of the great screenwriters, by the way, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Stepford Wives, etc., etc., 3 Days of the Condor, who had said that nobody in Hollywood knows anything. Now, that's a very pithy statement, and it sounds good. Is it true? And the answer is not really. Everybody does know something. Otherwise, why would you bother not just hiring anyone off the street to make a movie? Obviously, everyone has their level of expertise, but everyone also has their gaps. And those gaps can prove fatal if you don't have a team who can get together and play off of each other's criticisms and work to shape the work so that it pleases as much of what your company is making as it possibly can. Because your job in any creative job is to get another job. So if you make a movie that is your dream project and it loses a bunch of money, you might be satisfied because you did your artistic statement, but you won't work again. So there is this idea that you want to kind of compromise all of this. And unfortunately, the wrong part of what William Goldman said was often taken as holy writ, meaning that you could make any kind of cockamamie decision that was actually based on what would serve you better and justify, well, nobody knows everything or nobody knows anything in Hollywood. No, that doesn't mean that you make a stupid decision, such as Netflix's decisions to spend all that money on Mank or all that money on The Irishman, when you know that they're not going to bring in new audiences that take advantage of it. Generally pervasive corporate culture, well, we know that compared to the 90s, that's worse than it's ever been. And that this is an ongoing issue, that the corporate culture is such that if you do have something that's a little bit different and you are an artist who has a certain amount of power, yeah, you might be able to get something through, but if you're at all innovative, but you don't have that power structure behind you, you're going to get ignored. And that is indeed a problem. Now, when this article was written, we had just been through the disaster of Heaven's Gate. And the disaster of Heaven's Gate ended, at least through the present, the idea of directorial authorship, because Mike Cimino, the director of Heaven's Gate, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but I will anyway, made the mistake of spending a lot of money on that movie. And what became worse is once the disaster had happened and the dust was settling and production companies were folding around it, it turned out that Cimino, who had insisted on a certain field that looked great, but the field was owned by this SOB guy who was insisting on just a lot of money, much more so than the field was worth, but the look was so perfect. Well, guess who turned out to own that field? You're right, it was Mike Cimino. So he was ripping off the production company and pocketing the money. No wonder the Karma Police played catch up on him. And by the way, this is something else that people seem to forget, that just because you're a Hollywood executive and you're all swangy and you go to the right parties and serve the right cocaine, that you are exempt from the rules of karma. And no, karma might be late, but she's always there and she'll always take you for the sins that you've made, which is one of the reasons why I look at what Netflix is doing a lot of the time and say, just you wait. There's too much money. Boy, is that more true now than ever. There's money being spent with no way of recouping it. especially during the pandemic when the theaters were shut down. Fortunately, that's being reversed. Body snatching foreign directors. If only we would do this again. What was happening in the mid 90s is that if a director had any sort of juice from a foreign film, they would immediately try to bring him to the US. And in some instances, that worked really well, at least for a short term, such as Paul Verhoeven, who came over on a wave of success with Dutch movies and made some very good American pictures that were highly commercial. Of course, that all ended when he did Showgirls, but that did not stop him from being a good director nonetheless. General perverse corporate cowardice, movie stars as job insurance. Absolutely, that's still there today. The problem is that we haven't been building new stars. And remember, the trick of building a star is that that star proves themselves to be a star, not because their agent negotiates with them a 20 to 40 million payday, but they successfully open a bad movie. How many of the Chris's or Jennifer Lawrence's today have passed that test of being able to take a smaller movie and make it great, whether it be in the past, Pretty Woman, and in Tom Cruise's case, Risky Business, and then Top Gun, and then especially Cocktail. And you see what that means, that you have someone who will take something that's kind of a marginal project and make it fantastic simply by their presence. I would say that if you look at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you see a lot of star power in the form of Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio absolutely making that movie the big hit that it was. You know, I don't like that film either, but I'm not going to deny that the star power floated it a lot more than anything else. Everyone is creative, that's true. Corporate mentality, trickle-down effect, yes, very much so, that you have people in Hollywood being obsessed with the formula, and because they are obsessed with the formula, are passing that down through their junior execs. Only now their junior execs aren't people who necessarily love the business. They're people who love the Wall Street side of the business. So they're not the ones who are ultimately going to be able to carry the flag for a great project. And then we finally come to the wrap up of the article where they're kind of trying to give a view of how the movies can recover from this malaise. And then as now, the idea was give the creative control back to the people who know how to do it well. I'm going to add I know this is a repeated thing, the added side that you want to have executives who can sit on top of budget so you don't have another Heaven's Gate type situation happen. And they also point out that there was some innovation coming down the pike, such as the enormous success that was afforded to Four Weddings and a Funeral, a low budget film, very, very British in style, that happened to just absolutely bust the market. While you also had a film like Natural Born Killers, which was shall we say, controversial, and today looks perhaps worse than it did at that time, but still nonetheless did show that Hollywood would still be willing to be innovative when it suited them. And yes, we still have some of that innovation right now, but we definitely need more. So what's the bottom line of me going over this article? Well, the bottom line is that, yes, things always look bad, and that's always prior to the point where you might have another renaissance. Or knowing what had happened in the past is a good way to judge when you see everyone running around like a chicken with their head cut off saying the sky is falling and saying, yeah, it's been falling since probably 1897. So be aware that show business has gone through many, many bad times, and it will come through this one too. It's just that the business is being shaken up. And when there's a shakeup, there will be quote unquote blood in the streets. But if that opens it up to where you can have creatives once again get control, and perhaps on a lower budget level, to where you're not having to cover built-in incompetence and built-in log rolling to friends and relatives, as opposed to spending money on things that will show up on the screen. It's actually a good thing. And that's why, in spite of all of the troubles we have in Hollywood, I still love it. And that's also why those of us who are in the industry are in it, because we ultimately, at the end of the day, love our movies and television. And that, dear friends, is the bottom line.
Terry, what is it?
The stuff that dreams are made of.